at the beginning of June, we kicked off a series for the summer that we have titled Psalms of Summer. So all summer long, we've been looking at different psalms throughout the book of Psalms. And when it comes to the book of Psalms, the book of Psalms is the song book of the people of God. This is poetry. This is songs that have been written to declare the glory of God, the greatness of God, to sing about triumph of what God has led them through. And when it comes to the book of Psalms, there's a variety of different genres that we see in the Psalms, just like we see in modern music today, that not all music is the same, right? And so we've seen psalms of praise, just declaring the goodness of God, what he's done, his glory. We see psalms of lament that are centered on sadness and sorrow. We've seen psalms of thanksgiving and gratitude, thanking God for how he's led us towards victory, how he's placed our feet on a solid rock and a firm foundation. And today, as we continue in our series, the psalm that we come to today is what's classified as a psalm of confession. Here, the psalmist, which is King David, is so burdened and heartbroken by his own sin that he then writes a psalm and declares his sorrowfulness to God. And when it comes to sin in our own life, confession is often the last place that I think we run to. It's not where we want to go immediately. For most of us, if not all of us, our default tendency when it comes to our own sin is to hide from its reality, to bury it down deep, and to somehow cover it up and pretend like it's not there, right? It's to shove it off to the side. What we do when we sin, what we typically do is we try to minimize it and we try to justify it. I see this in my own life. I see this in the life of my kids. I remember a few days ago, we were just hanging out at home. One of our kids came into the room crying, and we were like, oh boy, here we go again. What are you crying about? And they were like, so-and-so pushed me. And I'm like, okay, here we go. So we get so-and-so into the room, and then we ask the pusher, hey, why did you push, right? And the very first thing that they start doing is they start to minimize the reality of what they've done. They're like, oh, I didn't push. I just high-fived them with two hands, Just did like one of these. Like, it wasn't even that hard, Dad. It was like a gentle, that was it. Like, they flopped. It was a total flop, And I'm like, okay, no. And then we finally get to the position where it's like, no, I actually pushed them. And then it's like, well, then why did you push them? It's like, well, they took this toy from me, and it's justified, right? And all of a sudden, now we're in this whole thing, and we're trying to get them to a point where they realize, I have sinned in this. I've done something wrong, and just to confess it, because we run away from that. I see this in my kids' life. I see this in my life all the time, right? I remember back in high school, when I was playing football in high school, it was our senior year, first game of the season, first play of the first game of the season. I was playing right tackle for our high school football team. Me and the guy that I was blocking ended up on the ground. He punched me in the gut secretly, and then when I was coming up, I punched him in the helmet. As if that was gonna do anything, it's a helmet, it hurt me more than it hurt him. And I remember we got a first down on that play, then it set us back, no longer a first down, got off to the sidelines, my coach just chewing me out. And I remember telling my coach, I was just getting up off of him. Like I was just using him as leverage to get off the ground. I didn't punch him. 2 days later, we watched the tape, he's like, Cummings, you punched him. Just trying to make excuses so that I don't feel this sense of guilt or this sense of shame in my life. When it comes to the sin in our life, that's where we run to, right? We try to cover it up. We try to erase it with all these different means and ways. We try to minimize it. We try to justify it. And the reason why we do this is we don't want to experience the brokenness of our own sin. We don't want to experience our shame. We don't want to experience our guiltiness. And so we try to cover it up in every way that we possibly can. But here's what we're going to see in the psalm today. What we're going to see today is that wholehearted joy is only possible with brokenhearted confession. That the only way to genuine joy in God is through the means of brokenhearted confession. And so here's the thing. If we want to experience the fullness of joy, we need to understand and we need to know how to deal with the sin in our life. And that's what this psalm is going to tell us. And so if you have a Bible with you, I want you to go ahead and open up to 2 Samuel chapter 11, okay? Now you might be thinking, Chris, we just talked about, we are in a series in the Psalms. You just said 2 Samuel. Why are we not in the Psalms? Well, great question. Glad you asked it. Sets me up for what I want to talk about next. Most Psalms that we oftentimes we see in the Psalms, different Psalms that are written based on certain occasions. So there's events throughout history that then these Psalms are written in light of those events. And Psalm 51 certainly is one of those events. Before you even hit verse 1 in this Psalm, this is what it says. It's to the choir master, a Psalm of David, when Nathan the prophet went to him after he had gone into Bathsheba. And so what we see is that is the occasion for the writing of this psalm. And so if we are going to understand what the psalmist, which is King David, what the psalmist is expressing, we first have to understand what the psalmist is experiencing. And so we're going to start in 2 Samuel chapter 11. We'll go a little bit into chapter 12, and then we're going to flip over to Psalm chapter 51 to see how David responds to the reality of his own sin. And so 2 Samuel chapter 11, starting in verse 1, here's how the story begins. It says, in the spring of the year, the time when kings go out to battle, David sent Joab and his servants with him, and all Israel. And they ravaged the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah. But David remained at Jerusalem. It happened late one afternoon when David arose from his couch and was walking on the roof of the king's house that he saw from the roof a woman bathing, and the woman was very beautiful. Now, before we dive deeper into this story, one of the things that we need to understand about this point in time is that Israel, in this particular point in time, is thriving. They have never been better than where they are right now. This is the height of King David's reign. He has united all 12 tribes together. He has conquered Jerusalem and has made it the capital of Israel. The Ark of the Covenant is safe in Jerusalem. He's conquered and defeated the majority of Israel's major enemies. Even right now, when it talks about them going out to battle and going out to war, it sounds like this is a regular routine at this point in time. It sounds like victory comes to them easily. Like it starts off in verse 1. It was the spring of the year, the time when we go out to war and we win, okay? They're just constantly finding favor over and over again. The border of Israel is as large as it ever gets. It'll expand a little bit under King Solomon's reign, the son of David, but other than that, it doesn't really get much bigger than right here. There is peace within Israel. There's economic growth within Israel. Israel is thriving at this point in time. And the person who gets the credit for why Israel is thriving so much is, besides just the favor of God upon them and the sovereignty of God, is King David. David is the one that leads them to this kind of prosperity. And now, notice where David is. Or notice where David should be. It says it was the springtime, the time when kings go out to battle. David sends out his army, sends out all of Israel to go to the front lines. But who's missing from the front lines? It's David. David doesn't go out to battle. He doesn't go out to war. He stays back in Jerusalem, which begs the question, what was so important that was happening in Jerusalem that caused David to stay home? Certainly, there's a war going on. There must have been something that was incredibly important for David to stay back and stay in his palace while there is war out there. And we see what's happening. In verse 2, he says, it happened late one afternoon when David arose from his couch. Where was David? Sitting on his couch. What was the important thing happening in Jerusalem? Nothing. There was nothing keeping David from going out to being with his army. He is lying on the couch. He is enjoying the prosperity of Israel. He is enjoying his past successes. That's where he is. He is comfortably on his couch. And let me tell you, when it comes to the sin in your life, here's the first thing we need to understand. Where we are most prone to attack is not at wartime. It's when we're comfortable on the couch. It's in times of comfort, in times of peace, in times where we've maybe dropped the guard a little bit and think, man, I'm good. Just picture David's mentality here. I mean, he's defeated Goliath. He's destroyed giants. He's conquered nations and enemies. At this point in time, certainly he's thinking, I just deserve a break. Like, I'm not going to go out to war. I'm not going to have that kind of mentality. I just deserve a break. I'm going to stay here on my couch. And it's that moment, while David is on his couch, that temptation comes in. And that temptation leads David to committing one of the most notorious sins in the entire Bible. Verse 3, and David sent and inquired about the woman. And one said, is not this Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite? So David sent messengers and took her, and she came to him, and he lay with her. Now she had been purifying herself from her uncleanness. Then she returned to her house, and the woman conceived, and she sent and told David, I am pregnant. David, not at war where he's supposed to be, comfortable on his couch, enjoying his past successes, lowers his guard, gets up off the couch, walks around the roof of his palace, sees a beautiful woman bathing in the distance, and temptation begins to set in. And David follows the age-old pattern of temptation that every single one of us has fallen into. He sees, he desires, and then he takes. Now, David couldn't have helped himself from not seeing. Okay? He wasn't expecting to see that when he was walking around the palace on his roof that day, but he could have prevented himself from taking. And in fact, there are other people in his life that try to prevent himself from doing that. Like the person speaks up, and as he inquires about this woman, he says, this is Bathsheba, the wife of Uriah? Like, he goes on to tell him, hey, this is someone's bride. This is someone's wife. Like, David, I know what you're thinking. Don't go down this road. This person's already taken. She's not yours. And yet David at this point in time has already made up his mind. He sees, he desires, he wants it. And because he's king, he knows that he can get what he wants. And so he has her come over and they engage in an act. And the way that the author writes this is it doesn't seem like that act is consensual. We don't know exactly how it went down, but what it seems like is David leverages his power, leverages his authority to get what his heart desires. And the result at this point in time is that Bathsheba becomes pregnant. And when David hears that news, David begins to freak out. He knows that everyone's going to know his sin pretty soon. And as that news comes to him, he then does what every single one of us does when we sin. He tries to hide it, and he tries to cover it up. He tries to protect his reputation. And so what David does is, as he hears this news, is he gets Uriah to come back from the front lines. Where is Uriah? Uriah's at war. That's why Bathsheba was home alone. Uriah was where he was supposed to be. David wasn't where he was supposed to be. Uriah comes back home and to David's request, and as he comes home, David greets him. And David's hope is that as Uriah is back in Jerusalem, that Uriah will naturally go to his house, get a nice rest in his bed, and ideally sleep with his wife. And his hope is that if he can get them together, then the child that will be born, everyone will think it's just Uriah's. And he can finally be off the hook. So Uriah comes back, hangs out with David for a night. David sends him back to his house. And what Uriah does is he sleeps at the door of the king's palace. He sleeps where every other servant of the king sleeps. The next morning, David wakes up and he's like, Uriah, why are you here? Why did you not go home? And Uriah's response is, we are at war, David. It's not time for me to be lying down in my bed. It's not time for me to be kicked up on the couch. We are at war. We need a wartime mentality right now. Uriah's response is incredibly noble, incredibly loyal. And David realizes he's in a bigger trouble than he first thought. So David tries again. Uriah, why don't you stay another night? That night, he comes over to David's place. There's a dinner. David gets him drunk, hoping that he'll compromise his morals. But the exact same thing happens. Uriah goes out, sleeps at the king's door, where all the other servants are. David now is sweating bullets. How on earth am I going to cover up this great sin of mine? And then he thinks of an idea. He takes what he knows about Uriah, his nobility, his loyalty, and he uses it against him. He weaponizes it. He thinks to himself, you know what? Uriah is so noble and so loyal, he'll do whatever anybody says. And so he takes a letter and he writes it to the commanding officer at the front lines. And he says, I want you to put Uriah at the front of the hardest fight that is being fought right now. And that as they go into battle, I want the rest of the army to back up, and I want Uriah just to be out there all alone because I want Uriah to die. David writes that letter. It is a death sentence to Uriah. And then you know what David does? You know how David gets it into the hands of the commanding officer? By giving it to Uriah. He writes a letter commanding him to be at this position, to die, and then gives it into the hand of Uriah to deliver to the commanding officer. So now Uriah has to go from Jerusalem to the front lines of the battle with this death sentence in his hand. Don't you think that Uriah would have been tempted to open it up? Like it's probably a scroll. He could just unravel it a little bit, just kind of read what it has to say. It would have saved his life if he did that. But even though Uriah was tempted to look at what the letter had to say, Uriah, unlike David, had a wartime mentality, and he doesn't. He goes to the commanding officer, gives him the letter, and everything that David said becomes reality. He puts Uriah at the front lines. They go out to war. The army falls back, and Uriah dies. When the news of Uriah's death hits Jerusalem, there's probably a weight on David's heart that drops. David now has the ability to marry Bathsheba, and now everyone thinks that that kid is his and it's okay. He's thinking to himself, nobody knows. I got away with it. Until one day, about a year later, a knock comes on David's door from Nathan the prophet. Prophets in the Old Testament were people that God spoke to so that they could be the mouthpiece of God to the rest of Israel. And Nathan comes knocking on David's door with a message. And in verse 1 of chapter 12 of 2 Samuel, we see what that message is. He says this in verse 1. It says, and the Lord sent Nathan to David. He came to him and said to him, there were two men in a certain city, the one rich and the other poor. The rich man had very many flocks and herds, and the poor man had nothing but one little ewe lamb, which he had bought. And he brought it up, and it grew up with him and with his children. It used to eat of his morsel and drink from his cup and lie in his arms. And it was like a daughter to him. Now there came a traveler to the rich man, and he was unwilling to take one of his own flock or herd to prepare for the guest who had come to him. But he took the poor man's lamb and prepared it for the lamb who had come to him. Nathan starts with this parable. He makes up this story in order to expose David's sin. And look at how David responds in verse 5. Then David's anger was greatly kindled against the man, and he said to Nathan, as the Lord lives, the man who has done this deserves to die. Nathan comes to David with a parable of sorts in order to expose the sin of David. And as David is hearing about what this man has done, David pronounces judgment on this person and says, this person deserves to die. David has no idea that he just convicted his own self. And the reality for David is that he did deserve to die. In the law of God in Deuteronomy chapter 22, verse 22, it says, if a man is found lying with the wife of another man, both of them shall die. The man who lay with the woman and the woman, you shall purge the evil from Israel. David knew that his crime, his sin, was punishable by death. And so when David declares this man deserves to die, he is absolutely right. And then what Nathan does is he flips the script on David. And in verse 7 it says, Nathan said to David, you are the man. You're the one who's done this. This is just a story to show you that God has revealed to me your sin. You're the one, David. You've committed this kind of sin. And you're the one deserving of death. Now imagine if you were Nathan at this moment. How terrifying must it have been to come to the king and declare this to him? I mean, just think about this. When David sinned against Bathsheba, the way he covered up was by killing another man. Like, you don't think Nathan thought, if I go to David, that I might lose my life? Like, if he killed Uriah, he can certainly kill me. But Nathan comes to David in boldness and declares to him what God has revealed to him. And now here's the question lingering in 2 Samuel. How will David respond? David's sin is known. It is out there. It is now officially exposed. How now does David respond? Does he try to continue to cover it up? What does he do? And that is where we find ourselves in Psalm 51. And so let's go to Psalm 51. And let's see, how does David respond to his sin being exposed by Nathan? He starts off by saying this, "Have mercy on me, O God, according to your steadfast love, according to your abundant mercy, blot out my transgressions. Wash me thoroughly from my iniquity and cleanse me from my sin." David's sin gets exposed. And what does David do? Does he keep running? Does he keep trying to hide it, trying to cover up, trying to erase it? No. What David does is he comes directly to God himself. And he says, "Have mercy on me, O God." He places all of his hope and all of his trust on the steadfast love and the abundant mercy of God. He knows he has done nothing to deserve the forgiveness of God. He is hoping and trusting in only the character of God alone. What David doesn't do is David doesn't pull out his resume and say, "God, look at all the great things I've done. I've killed giants. I've conquered enemies. I've established Jerusalem. I brought the ark in. It's safe. I've expanded the borders. God, look at all the great things I've done." He doesn't come to God with his resume. He doesn't come saying, I did make a mistake, but look at all this great stuff. He comes to God in humility and brokenhearted over his sin, trusting and hoping only in the steadfast love and the abundant mercy of God to bring forgiveness to him. And then as he comes to God, he then begins to confess his own sins. Verse 3 says, "For I know my transgressions, and my sin is ever before me." David owns his sin. He owns his mess. There's no more hiding anymore. He brings it forward. Verse 4, "Against you, you only have I sinned, and done what is evil in your sight, so that you may be justified in your words and blameless in your judgment." David knows at this particular point in time that he's done harm against other people. He's not trying to sweep that under the rug. But what he knows when he says, "I've sinned against God alone," is he's saying, I've predominantly, the ultimate terrible thing in all of this, that I've sinned against a holy God. That's the worst part of all of it, is that it's damaged my relationship with God. And he goes on and says that God is just in all of his actions. And so if God does not extend to me forgiveness, if he doesn't extend to me grace or mercy, he is totally just in doing so. Because he's a holy, just God. Verse 5, "Behold, I was brought forth in iniquity, and in sin did my mother conceive me. Behold, you delight in truth in your inward being, and you teach me wisdom in the secret heart." David expands his sin. As this sin gets exposed to his life, David knows this is not just the extent of his sin. It's not like I just did one bad thing for a few days. He recognizes that this is a problem deep within his spirit and deep within his soul. He says, "I was born in iniquity. I was brought forth in this. That I have a sinful nature by default. I can't help but sin. I'm attracted to it." And he begins to realize that his sin goes well beyond just this action, that it goes well into just who he is. And he confesses before God. Says, "God, forgive me of what I've done. Only your love and your mercy will bring forgiveness." And then he owns his sin and he confesses it before God. And then what he's going to do next is he's going to ask for God to restore him. But I want you to notice what he prays for. I want you to notice what kind of restoration he asks for. Look at verse 7. It says, "Purge me with hyssop. I shall be clean. Wash me, and I shall be whiter than snow. Let me hear joy and gladness. Let the bones that you have broken rejoice. Hide your face from my sins and blot out all my iniquities. Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me. Cast me not away from your presence, and take not your Holy Spirit from me. Restore to me the joy of your salvation, and uphold me with a willing spirit. Notice that when David prays for restoration, to be made whole, that the primary thing he's asking for is for his relationship with God to be restored. That's what he longs for. That's what he desires more than anything. See, here's the thing with us. I think that's different than this. I think oftentimes with us, when our sin gets exposed and comes into the light, I think what makes us heartbroken more than anything isn't necessarily that our relationship with God has been damaged. I think most often it's our reputation that's damaged. And the reason our hearts are so broken is because that reputation just took a hit and a blow to the side. And if we were to pray this prayer, we would say, God, restore my relationships with other people. May they forgive me. May be able to move past all of this stuff. But what David does is he says, God, restore me to you. Like, I just want to be in your presence. Like, I feel distant from you. God, restore me to you. That's what I want more than anything else. David knows that what he needs more than anything is a closeness with God. And notice that as David asks and requests God to restore him, notice that in this text, there's no mention of sex. There's no mention of murder. It's not, God, forgive me, I confess, now help me not do that again. What's the prayer of David? Verse 12, restore to me the joy of your salvation. Why does David focus in on joy? The reason why is because David knows something we often forget. David knows that all sin is symptomatic of joylessness in God. That's where it starts. The sex, the murder for David, the lying, the deceit, those are all just symptoms of a far greater disease. And the far greater disease is joylessness in God. And so David's primary prayer is, God, restore to me the joy of your salvation. And then he goes on in verse 13 and says, may this joy be so extreme that it overflows to everyone else around me. It says in verse 13, then I will teach transgressors your ways, and sinners will return to you. Deliver me from blood guiltiness, O God of my salvation, and my tongue will sing aloud of your righteousness. O Lord, open my lips, and my mouth will declare your praise, for you will not delight in sacrifice, or I would give it. You would not be pleased with a burnt offering. The sacrifices of God are a broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart, O God, you will not despise. David's primary prayer in his restoration is that God will restore to him joy. Because the underlying disease of all of our sin is joylessness in God Almighty. And so he prays, God, would you restore my joy so much so that it would just overflow out of me to everyone else? That everyone would hear of how great you are. Everyone hear about your steadfast love and your abundant mercy, because my joy is so full in you. He prays for that kind of restoration. See, when it comes to the joy of the Christian is always a broken joy. Because where it starts is being brokenhearted over our own sin. But where it leads is to the fullness of joy. To the fullness of joy and the delight in God. And here's the good news for us today, is that no matter what you've done, no matter what sin you've committed against God Almighty, when you come to him in brokenhearted confession, here's the guarantee. He will meet you with love and grace and mercy and forgiveness. All you have to do is come to him. And the reason why he always meets you there is because Jesus took your sin to the cross and he killed it. At the cross of Jesus, he dies for our sin. he removes our sins completely. And through his resurrection, he gives us the newness and the fullness of life. Wholehearted joy is found at the cross of Jesus Christ. And so come to him. That is where joy is found. And then David ends this psalm with a vision of Israel. He says, do good to Zion in your good pleasure. Build up the walls of Jerusalem. Then you will delight in right sacrifices, in burnt offerings and whole burnt offerings. Then bulls will be offered on your altar. Whenever I was studying this text, those last two verses seemed very odd to me. Like, how did we get here? And then what David is praying is he's praying that Jerusalem would be a place of worship, that worship would overflow to all the other nations, that they would see the glory of God through the lens of Israel. But the reality is that for worship to exude like that, it must start with brokenhearted confession. So David's prayer at the end is that the whole nation of Israel would recognize their sin, come to the Lord and experience holistic worship. That their hearts would be overflowing with joy in him. And man, that's my hope for us as a church today. That we wouldn't be a people that tries to hide from our sin, try to minimize it, try to justify it, but that we would come to the Lord with broken-hearted confession so that we might be restored to wholehearted joy. And when a church is like that, the nations see, the people around us see the goodness and the glory of God, his mercy, his grace, which is offered to every single one of us. And so if you're here today, maybe you've been carrying just this sense of guilt and shame, I just want to encourage you, come to the cross of Jesus. I'm going to go ahead and ask the band to come back up. And what I want to do over the next few minutes is I just want to give us some time to just come and bring our sins before God. Well, what David is encouraging us here is that there is grace and there is mercy found in the arms of God. And that we can come to him and experience the forgiveness that he has bought for us on the cross. And so what I want to do is I just want to take a moment for every single one of us, just right where we are, to just come to the Lord. And whatever it is that's weighing on us, just to confess those things to him.